We love to think of ourselves as these brave explorers, right? People who crave freedom, growth, the open road. But if you take a really honest look at your life, you'll probably find a quieter and maybe more unsettling truth that's actually running the show.
I know that sounds a little weird, but just think about it for a second. How often do we choose to stay in a familiar cage? A job we've outgrown, a relationship that's gone a bit stale, instead of stepping out into the great unknown? And why do we do that? Well, because to our brain, the unknown isn't just a blank space. It registers as a biological threat.
And that gets us right to the heart of what we're talking about today. There's this psychological structure that's designed to keep us exactly where we are. Let's call it the architecture of fear.
What's so fascinating is this split right here. We tell ourselves this story that we're the explorer, but our behavior often proves we're the creature just looking for a safe corner. We stay put not because we're lazy, but because deep down in our wiring, the familiar pain feels way more manageable than the unknown joy feels safe.
So how did we get wired this way? Where do these blueprints even come from? To really get it, we have to go way back and look at how our internal systems were built, starting with our evolutionary history.
See, our brains didn't really evolve to make us wise or happy. They evolved to help us survive, to react super quickly to threats. For our ancestors, that rustle in the grass wasn't something to ponder. It was a potential predator. That's why survival mode is our factory default setting. It's fast, it's emotional, it's reactive. Our reasoning mode, on the other hand, is slow, it's logical, and it takes real, conscious effort to turn it on. It's like a manual override.
And for a lot of us, this architecture got reinforced really early on. If you grew up in a home that felt a little unpredictable, your brain probably learned to stay on high alert. You learned to see calm not as peace, but as the quiet moment before the storm. You developed this intense independence because depending on other people felt like a gamble you just couldn't take. And you know what? That's not a flaw. That was a brilliant adaptation to help you survive.
Okay, so we have the blueprints, but what does it actually feel like to live inside this architecture every day? Let's take a look at how this all shows up in our thoughts and behaviors, especially for people who are pretty smart and analytical.
Have you ever caught yourself doing this? Instead of just feeling sad or angry or scared, you immediately jump to analyzing why you're feeling that way. You treat it like a math problem to be solved instead of, just an experience to have.
Yeah, there's actually a name for that. It's called cognitive distancing, and it's a really clever defense mechanism. Your brain uses logic to create a little space from feelings that seem too big or too messy to handle. The only downside? It can make you seem a little emotionally distant to the people around you, even when you actually care a whole lot.
And this architecture creates other kinds of echoes too. Chronic overthinking, that's just your brain's powerful processors stuck in an endless loop. Perfectionism, that's not about being arrogant. It's when you can see the perfect outcome so clearly that just starting feels like setting yourself up for failure. And nervous laughter, that's just your brain's emergency pressure release valve when an emotion gets too intense to hold in.
Okay, so this all sounds a little intense, right? But here's the most important part. The goal isn't to conquer your fear. You can't just fight your own programming. But what you can do is update the blueprints.
The master skill we need is something called cognitive flexibility. And what psychologists will tell you is that this is a sign of real intelligence. It's the ability to see new evidence and say, maybe I was wrong. It's about unhooking your ego from your ideas and just letting your thinking evolve.
All right, so how do we actually do this? It's basically a three-step process. First, you practice the pause. Just creating that tiny gap between feeling an impulse and acting on it is where you switch from survival mode to reasoning mode. Second, use neutral language. This is terrifying, sends your brain into a panic. But this is a new data point, keeps it in problem-solving mode. And third, you just question your own thinking. The simple act of asking, what if I'm wrong here, can short-circuit that emotional spiral.
And that's the whole game right there. When you lower the emotional temperature of a situation, you're not ignoring your feelings. You're just turning down the volume so that the calm, logical, planning part of your brain has a chance to get online and help you make a smarter choice.
So what does all this really mean for us? It means we have to start seeing the unknown differently, not as this scary thing to be avoided at all costs, but as the only place where anything new, anything better can actually happen.
I want you to really let this sink in. That hypervigilance, that fierce need for control, it was built for a reason. It was there to protect a version of you that absolutely needed it to get by. But you're not that person anymore. And those old survival strategies,
they might be the very walls that are holding you back today.
And that's really the big idea to take away. Predictability feels safe, sure, but it's also stagnant. Real intelligence isn't about knowing all the answers before you begin. It's having the mental flexibility to step into uncertainty, knowing that's where all the good stuff, all the growth, actually is.
So I want to leave you with this question. Just think about one area of your life, your job, a relationship, a habit. What familiar room are you staying in? Not because you love it, but just because you know all the rules. And what do you think might happen if you were just brave enough to open the door and step outside?